Now let's look at the implementation of the application. In this assignment, one of the goals is to demonstrate to you the behavior-driven design. So now we understand the overall design of the game and from a user perspective, and we're gonna use the user stories to drive the development, and particularly we're going to use a tool called Cucumber to turn our user stories into runnable acceptance tests. So when we have a user story, we know how our application should behave in a certain situation. So, but with the Cucumber, we can describe that situation, that scenario, and then we can, of course, with some magic behind the scene, we can make it executable. So we can always rerun the test to ensure that nothing breaks. But at the very beginning, before we write any production code, it should break. This is called the red-green refactor cycle. So we start with the game, a test which describes the user story and describes what a program is supposed to do. Right? It defines the meaning of good. It's what is acceptable. So we're going to start with one story. It's called the start new game story, and in Cucumber terminology is called a feature. And then we have this paragraph that looks very much like a user story. So as a player, so I can play hand person, I want to start a new game. And then we can, in this test, we can have a number of scenarios. Each one describes a scenario with a set of steps. You don't need to understand all the details, and this is a quick introduction, and you will learn how to the details so you can write your own tests. So we have in the scenario, as you can see, it's very high level, but it describes all this story to a certain level of detail, so it's detailed enough, right? It's high level, but it's also detailed enough. Given I'm on the home page, I press new game, I should see guess a letter. I press new game again, I should see guess a letter. Okay, so this test describes the acceptable behavior of our program with the conditions. So when I'm at this place, I do something and something should happen. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. Anyone can read and understand what this scenario is. I'm going to see how we can actually run this scenario and use it to drive our development. So we'll start with the start new game feature. Let's look at the feature first, the test file first. So it's in the features directory, and then we have start new game. Okay, this is exactly what we see on the slide. And now let's go to our project and then run this test. Cucumber. Okay, it has failed as expected, and we can see that it's failing at this step, given I'm on the home page and the error says no route matches get. Well, let's dig in a little bit to see why we get this error. In our feature, in our test file, we have those clauses, and the reason we can run this kind of scenario is because we have something called step definitions that will try to match what we see here to some detailed steps. Okay, let's look at our game step definition. There's a definition when I'm on something. So this is a Ruby code with a regular expression, and then it will take whatever the parameter, whatever matches this part, the name of the page, and then we'll visit that page. Okay, so home page basically is the root of our application. So now it makes sense because we haven't defined this root yet. So we'll do that next. So here we'll add this route to the routes file. And we'll add it here. So this basically tells Rails that when user goes to the root, it should trigger this action, the new action on the game's controller. And then in Rails, this action always maps to a method with the same name. Okay, so that's what we want. Well, this is according to the design of our game, right? So we have this game action, this new action, right? That's what should cause give the user a chance to start a new game. Okay, so with the added route, let's run the test again. Okay, it has passed that step, but now it gives a new error no route matches post create. Why is it happening? Well, here's something we can do. Let's start a new terminal, and I'm gonna run start our app and take a look. Okay, now our app is running. Okay, we see the home page, and if you look at the source, in our new view, we have this button called new game, and it's gonna trigger this, it's gonna send a request, a post request to this URL, create. But in our routes, we don't really have a route that matches this post method to the create action. So that's why we're getting this error, and that makes sense because when the cucumber scenario asks the browser simulator to click on this new button, new game button, it's going to trigger that action. But our app, as of right now, doesn't know how to handle that. So let's follow our instructions here. We're going to add this route to our routes.rb file. Now let's rerun our test. Oh, copied the wrong thing. Now let's add this route to our routes file. Now let's rerun our test. Okay, now we're getting a different error. The action create cannot be found for game controller. Well, we're getting this error because now we have a route that will match this action, but it's gonna call the create method on games controller, but we don't have that method defined yet. So we're gonna add the method to our controller to handle that event or that action. So games controller should be in app controllers and game controller. We'll add it here. Okay. Let's take a look at it really quick. So when create is called, according to our design, we're supposed to create a new game object because that encapsulates our game logic, and then we need to store it so that the same game object is available in the session between our app and a particular user. So we want to remember that. Remember we have those helper methods already defined, so we don't need to worry about the details. Just simply we just need to call this method, and then according to our design, once the game is created, as a result, we want to show the state of the game, and then we're gonna call redirect the user to the show action. Okay, well, let's try rerun our test. Okay, now we get this error. There's no route matches this show action. Well, that's correct. Indeed, we don't have this this route defined yet. So let's define that now. Okay, we'll define that because we now have a controller method that redirects user to that action. And if we look at the test result, it's doing the right things, right? So when we press on new game, it's supposed to create the game, but then redirect user to the show action, but we don't have that action. We don't have that route defined yet. Okay, so it's doing the right thing. Now, once we define the route, let's see what happens. Okay, now it's complaining that we have a method called wrong guesses that is not defined. Well, this is a little confusing, but if we dig a little deeper, we'll see that it happens in this show.html.erb file. Well, now we have a route that goes to the that triggers the show action. That happens when user click on the new game button. Then we create a new game on the server, but then we immediately redirect the user to the show action. So that will cause the show action to be triggered. And in our controller code, we don't have that method defined. But Rails is designed in such a way that we don't have to have that method, but it always by default, by convention, use the view that with the same method to render the result of that action. So we will use show.html.erb to show the result of the action with the same name, which is show. And in this view, we do assume there's a game object that has those methods we can call. Right? So that's why we get that error showing the wrong guesses is not defined, because we don't have the object. Well, we have that object is nil, so nil of course doesn't have that method defined. So to make it to pass that step, we need to add this show method to the controller. So in the controller, we add the show method. In the show method, we don't really need to do anything because we know that when show method is called, we should have an object already created. We just need to load it from the session, and then it's if you look at the load method, it always creates this instance variable object that can be used by the views that renders the result of this action. Okay, well, let's run the test again. Okay, well, this time the test passed. Now let's do some verification manually. Okay, so we're at the root of our app, so we can start new game. We can start new game again. So every time we get a word of different size. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Now we have some code written, and we also have tests that ensures that it's indeed working, and it's very convenient. We don't have to do manual testing, and it gets tedious pretty quickly. And now with the test, we can just run the execute this command. It will run the test, and then this is called acceptance test because it tests the application from user perspective. So it defines what is acceptable. So if user think this is acceptable behavior, we have a way to run this test and to show the user indeed our application implements this correct behavior.